Good morning, and welcome to a new episode of Meatpacking Unpacked, Community Connected, brought to you by the Meatpacking District. My name is Jeffrey LeFrancois, and I'm the Executive Director of the Meatpacking Business Improvement District. Today, I'm joined by Amit Singh Bagga, Deputy Director of the New York City Census 2020 office. In his role, he has overseen the bulk of the office's operations, in particular, the building and launch of the $19 million NYC Complete Count Fund, the nation's largest municipal investment in census-focused community organizing, and the city's $8 million census media and advertising campaign. During the last 13 years, Amit has held several different roles in government, on political campaigns and in the nonprofit sector, working on policy development, legislation, community organizing, as well as on press and communications. This work has covered a wide range of issues, including immigration, consumer financial protection, low-wage workers' rights, food insecurity, poverty, as well as LGBTQI issues and foreign affairs. He is a native of the Bronx and a proud son of two Punjabi refugees from the 1947 partition of India. Amit is now a resident of Queens by way of several boroughs, Montreal, Washington, and Bombay, which he considers his second home. I'm also proud to call him a friend. So Amit, thank you for being here today.
Thank you so much, Jeffrey. I'm very proud to call you a friend, and thank you for hosting this important conversation.
Absolutely. And thanks for what you're doing. So if you know what year it is, and you kind of are familiar with what happens every 10 years in this country, the census is going on. Big picture, what does that mean?
Well, the census, as I think most of your viewers, I'm sure, know at this point, is a count of every single person in the country. And this is, completely irrespective of who you are, where you're from, what your immigration status is. Every single person must be counted. And why is this important? This is important because the census is the very foundation that determines the rightful and fair distribution of money, power, and also respect throughout the country to states, cities, and communities. $1.5 trillion every single year for education, for housing, for healthcare, for infrastructure, for job training that the federal government distributes to states and cities across the country is based on the census figures. In addition to that, all 435 states in the seats of House of Representatives, all of those are distributed based on this population count, and that changes every 10 years. And so it's really critical that for any city or state and community to ensure that they have the rightful access to the money and power that are guaranteed to them by the Constitution, that they are fully counted in the census. And just lastly, I would say the census, and this is important, I think, on a very individual level for all of us, is about respect. The census is our way to say, we're here. We matter, and when it comes to those people who are in charge making decisions about our political and economic future, we are the ones who are standing up and being counted by showing up in the rolls and making sure that our needs, our issues, and priorities are being addressed.
Thank you for that. I think the two things that were unique to hear in that, well, always is the use of the word people and not resident, because it doesn't matter any type of status. If you're a person in the United States, we need to know and have that be counted for. And then this respect approach is very interesting because 2020 has proven to be quite a year. And the census, I think, is always a challenge. But this year you're dealing with a pandemic, the Black Lives Matter movement. We have an election. We didn't have that. 2010 wasn't an election year, a presidential election year in the census count. So do you think that's affected, generally speaking, the count and the way things are happening in the city right now?
Absolutely. I mean, to be perfectly honest with you, Jeffrey, this census could not have been dealt a worse hand. Starting with the protracted fight around the attempted addition of the citizenship question, the Trump administration tried to add a question about citizenship to the census. They failed because the city of New York, along with many other cities and states, we took them all the way up to the Supreme Court. We won, and RIP Justice Ginsburg. It started with that, and then it went into the fact that the Trump administration actually severely underfunded the census to begin with. The Obama administration had actually, and Congress, had pumped a lot of money into outreach for the 2010 census and also making the 2010 census very accessible through mobile questionnaire assistance centers and all sorts of different outreach methodologies. The Trump administration did away with all of that. And then, of course, despite the fact that for many of us, the census is actually really very easy to respond to this year because you can do it online, you can call. These are not things that were available in 2010. For lots of Americans that don't have reliable access to broadband, that does prove to be a challenge. And also just historically, psychologically, people are accustomed to either completing the census by mail or by speaking to someone at the door. And so, just changing people's sort of understanding and shifting people's understanding of how the census is actually conducted has been a challenge. Now, add to that an unprecedented global pandemic that has made in-person outreach completely impossible, which is really, really critical here in New York City in order for us to reach communities that are in the margins, communities where linguistic and culturally appropriate outreach is really important. And add to that we just have constant attacks from the White House on immigrants, on people of color, and people don't trust the federal government. People don't want to be participating in an exercise that many people perceive as intrusive. And despite the fact that census information is literally protected by the strongest federal privacy laws on the books, census information cannot be shared with anyone, not with the CIA, not with the FBI, not with local law enforcement, not with the tax authorities, not with the immigration authorities. Despite those protections, there is a deep-set sense of lack of trust in the federal government. And so trying to address all of these issues has been incredibly, incredibly challenging. I would like to say that I think here in New York City, we've been certainly more successful than we even thought we would be. We are now within striking distance of our 2010 number. We're less than a point away.
Which is remarkable given the circumstances of this year.
Yes, absolutely. So as of this past Friday, we cracked the 60% mark. We ended at just shy of 62% in 2010. And what we did was really, we built an infrastructure prior to the pandemic that actually enabled us to pivot very quickly when the pandemic hit. So even though we did lose, some of the really important outreach that I've already discussed, we immediately switched to, mass phone banking and also mass texting. This is, a type of technology, a type of outreach method that's now been used by many political campaigns. And between the middle of March and last week, we've now called nearly 4 million New Yorkers, and we have sent more than 7 million texts. And this is a really important way to reach New Yorkers at a time when we can't talk to them face to face. And I would also like to mention, we mounted the largest campaign in New York City government's history when it comes to media, a $9 million campaign that ran 34 different campaigns in 26 languages. And so, we know that we can see it in the numbers. This has worked, and we have now pulled ahead in our self-response rate of many major cities in America. We're now just beating Chicago, even though they were ahead of us this entire time. So, we feel very confident that these tactics and our ability to pivot have proven to be successful.
And how much time do we have left? Is it the end? Yeah. Is that still in flux? I mean, because the Trump administration had cut a month off, right? Wasn't it supposed to go to the end of October?
Yes, Jeffrey. So you ask a very interesting question. It's a question we ask ourselves, all the time, because the goalposts with the census keep changing. So when COVID hit, the Trump administration itself, which it has the authority to do, extended it until October 31st.
Because we were supposed to finish in the summer?
That's right. The original date, so the original date for the census to end was July 31st.
Got it.
Thank you for pointing that out. So it was extended until October 31st. There was broad bipartisan agreement around this. Late July, the nation was informed that the White House had made this totally politically calculated decision to cut the census short by a month. And as of right this moment, you and I sitting here speaking, having this conversation, it is slated to end next Wednesday, September 30th, so in 6 days. However, because this move is sort of a bald-faced political move to an attempt to force an undercount of major cities, of Black and brown communities, of immigrant communities. Several lawsuits were filed against the Trump administration challenging this particular shortening. One particular lawsuit that has moved quickly, and I would say ferociously through the courts, is one filed by the National Urban League in federal court in California. Judge Lucy Koh is expected to render a decision on that particular filing either today or tomorrow. And we very much expect, given the way that case has gone, that she's going to issue an injunction that would, in essence, extend the census once again. By exactly how many days or weeks, that remains to be seen. And what an appeal would look like by the Trump administration to the Supreme Court challenging that decision, obviously that remains to be seen as well. Obviously also lots to monitor there in terms of the current balance of the court. So we are operating in the doomsday worst case scenario that the census ends in 6 days, and we want every single New Yorker to go get counted right now. My2020census.gov or 844-2020. This is really about New York City's future, your future, and my future.
What are people, I understand the inherent fear of lack of trust in the federal government, of not understanding the protection around privacy of this information. The conversations that you're having, do folks feel comfortable filling out on the internet? Do they like the paper? Do they like the mail aspect of it? What are you finding since it's different this time? Because I think 10 years from now, it's gonna be a whole other ballgame. And so what are we learning this time around?
That's a great question, Jeffrey. And I think the answer to that question here in New York City is really a complex one, because New York City is such a complex and diverse place. You know, we talk to many people that say, my gosh, it couldn't have been easier to fill out. I never realized how important it was. And it took me 5 minutes. I mean, literally people will say it took me 5 minutes. And I'm done, you know, and now I've told 5 of my friends to do it. We'll talk to certain immigrant groups that say, you know, it was really helpful that the Census Bureau made the census available in 13 languages by phone, because that's actually, you know, a more comfortable way for members of our community to fill it out. Also, obviously, varying degrees of, you know, internet access in different communities. And, you know, you talk to a whole bunch of seniors. If you go to Canarsie in Brooklyn, or you go to Wakefield in the Bronx, and you talk to sort of older, you know, Black homeowning seniors, they really preferred the mail, you know, and if you actually look at the percentage of the response that took place via mail as compared to the internet, it's much higher in some of these communities. So what we do know for this year is that it is actually a good thing that the Census Bureau made the ability to respond in many different ways possible, because people still have varying levels and degrees of comfort and accessibility. Like you say, I think 2030, it's going to be a totally different ballgame, and we'll see.
Yeah. So, excuse me. What does the census mean? I mean, it affects all of us, but can you just say, what does it mean for business, right? Like, we talk to a lot of businesses here in the Meatpacking District because we're a commercial district. So how is it important? What's the lens that we can look through it for business purposes?
Absolutely. That's a great question. So, businesses, both large and small, always, utilize census data to make critically important decisions about how to invest, where to invest, and really what, the neighborhood is going to look like, or the community or city is going to look like, where they're choosing to put their dollars to hire employees, et cetera. Places where you see increases in population, for example, businesses are going to want to invest there. Places where you see increases of certain different types of communities, businesses are going to want to make different types of decisions about, what types of businesses will open in these areas. In addition to that, census data, and this is, I think really important here in the New York City context, is utilized by the city government to make really important decisions about public services. And I'm not just talking about public benefits, right? I'm talking about public services. So, for example, garbage collection routes, whether or not a neighborhood needs additional fire services, whether or not a neighborhood needs additional health services. These are public services that, align and really support business communities, right? They obviously support residents, but they also support business communities. And so when you do not have complete and accurate information about how many people live where, those services also cannot be provided for in a way that makes sense, which kind of makes it really difficult for business to be able to see the return on investment that they want to see, as we know, businesses rely on public services also operating well, right? Which is one of the reasons why business leaders have such a stake in making sure that these services are well organized and well funded. And all of that is based on census data. Also when it comes to healthcare, and I think this is just an important quick plug to make,
Sure.
Given the situation we all find ourselves in, vaccines. Last year, in the last 18 months, there was a measles outbreak in a couple of different neighborhoods in New York City, and the Department of Health really looked at census data to understand, what is the volume of vaccinations that would be required that perhaps weren't, previously available in this particular community, right? And so when it comes time for us to understand, who needs a COVID vaccine, how many people there are, how many seniors there are, how many kids there are under 5, all of that is based on census data. And so we want to make sure that the people who are making these decisions are making them based on complete and accurate information, which is why, census data really is the cornerstone of the way we all function.
That's remarkable when you think about the amount of policy that is informed by this, count. In between each census count, we have the American Community Survey. How does that play a role here? Does that help the city prepare for its every decade count? What does that get us?
Yeah, so the American Community Survey, to try and put it in sort of more granular terms, we all hear all of this information kind of all the time, right? We'll hear it either in advertising or we'll hear it just when on the internet, we'll see something, the average income in the United States, the average income in a county or, in a city, the average family size in a given place, right? What the demographics of a given city or state or even a neighborhood look like. How do we know this information, right? Most of this information is not actually collected in the census. The census is 10 simple questions. There are no questions about income, et cetera. A lot of that information is collected by the American Community Survey, which is a much more in-depth survey. It's generally sent every year to approximately 3.5% of the American population. And it is a much more in-depth survey that seeks to collect this information so that we can actually have a much deeper, complex, and more complete picture of our nation. What do we actually look like? Who are we? How much money is flowing into which communities? And that really allows us to understand kind of our own identity, right? When we think about our identity, there's so many different layers to it. Our identity as a nation, our identity as a city, as a community, as a neighborhood. And it also allows us to plan, right? Again, going back to the idea that census data is the cornerstone of making all of these really important decisions, the American Community Survey fills in the gaps where, the census has not collected the information. And again, very important for cities, very important for businesses, and really gives us a picture of who we are.
Yeah, that's pretty significant when you think about all the things that comes into play with that. Is there anything else on this that you want to add before I pivot to the next part of our program? Because you've done a tremendous amount of work, and thank you for doing that because it literally affects everyone. And it's going to be interesting. Do we have any recourse besides this California decision? In 2010, I think we went to court because we were undercounted. What happens in terms of recourse in that way?
Absolutely. So I'll make a plug for one thing that I think is really important for Manhattanites to hear, and then I'll answer your question. So one of the challenges that we've seen in the census this year here in New York City is that, very understandably, there are a lot of people in New York City who had the ability, the financial ability, the socioeconomic ability to leave the city for a period of time. And unfortunately, what happened is that literally the very first day that the city announced that COVID was, really becoming an issue here in New York City is the very first day that the census began here in New York City, and people started receiving the first postcards in the mail asking them to fill out the census. It was over the course of that next week that those postcards arrived, and it was over the course of that next week that people left. And what we've seen is that all over Manhattan, from the Upper East Side to Midtown to downtown, including Meatpacking and West Village, the self-response rates are really, really lagging behind where they were in 2010. Now, we know some of this is just people didn't see the card, so they didn't realize that they had to do it. And understandably, March, April, beginning part of May, COVID was completely consuming everything, right? We couldn't really focus on much else. But we really need to remind every single New Yorker, no matter where you've been since March or April, if you are otherwise a New York City resident and you were living here, prior to April 1st, it is imperative that you go online and complete the census right now using your New York City address. My2020census.gov, you don't need a special code. It's going to prompt you for a code. You don't need one. I just want to remind everyone, no matter what you are contemplating in terms of your state of residence for tax purposes, the census is completely confidential. None of that information is ever shared with the IRS. If you were living here prior to April 1st, please use your New York City address to complete it, because for every household that does not complete the census, we lose $7,000 every single year. And you take all the households in Manhattan that haven't yet responded, and you put that together, it's millions and millions and millions over the course of 10 years. So really important that our fellow New Yorkers do their part. To quickly answer your question in terms of recourse, we'll have to see what happens with the case in terms of, whether or not the census gets extended. But really, once the census data is fully packaged and processed and we see the results, that's going to give us a sense of whether or not we think the census was actually accurately, fully conducted here in New York City. We know self-response is, very, very accurate because you yourself are filling out the information, you're submitting it. It's kind of like voter fraud, like pretty much does, there's a guarantee that the information is correct. The door knocking is very complex, right? We don't know how that necessarily goes. And, in immigrant neighborhoods where you've had ICE raids over the last several months, we know people aren't necessarily answering the doors, right? We know people are also not necessarily home on the Upper East Side because they've been elsewhere. So, we're really going to have to see what those results look like. And if we feel like, the door knocking didn't go well, we may have to consider litigation against the Census Bureau as we did in 2010.
Thank you for that. Super helpful. And this was very informative conversation. But I want to take a moment to get to my favorite part of the program, where we unpack a little bit more about you. And it's my 5 sort of fire round questions. Don't be scared, I promise. But it just paints a fuller picture, like the census does, of the country of Amit. So, paintings or photography?
Ooh, photography.
Okay. Coffee or tea? Oh, wait, you have a caveat.
Wait. In terms of viewing or showcasing?
Well, I mean, now you're asking for additional layers of the question.
This is our own American community survey.
I guess I pictured it as in terms of what you like to look at.
Photography.
Okay. Coffee or tea?
Coffee.
How do you take it?
Only espresso, 2 Splendas.
I love the tone change there. Prints or solids?
Prints. Always prints.
It was kind of obvious as soon as I saw your shirt today. Cooking or baking?
Oh, this is a tough one. Well, I would have to go with cooking.
All right. You seem upset about that.
Well, I think it's because I aspire to be a better baker than I am.
But you have to be so precise in baking. That's the problem.
You do have to be very precise. You do have to be very precise.
And finally, beach or park?
Oh, honey. Give me a Speedo and a beautiful tent and a bottle of rosé and find me at the beach.
Sounds good to me. Thank you so much for this. We will be plugging the census as we have been until we can't anymore. So we'll be tracking when that stops. Really appreciate this conversation and for you joining us and all the great work you and your team are doing. And thank you all for joining us today for another episode of Meatpacking Unpacked. Don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel and stay tuned next week to hear from more of the district and the city's cast of characters across the political, cultural, and business spectrums. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you so much, Jeffrey.
Thanks, Amit.